Hey guys, welcome to the Sim Racing Paddock. I'm William March, and let's talk about force feedback. Now, one of the most hotly debated topics in sim racing is what sim is best. What sim feels the best, what sim has the best content, what sim has the best driving experience, etc. So I want to address that first question. What sim feels the best? And that is a bit of a rough topic, because if we approach the question as what sim is a true one-on-one life recreation of the feel of a real-life car, the answer is none of them. And that's because we have all of these forces that are enacted as driving in a real car that we just, as of right now, cannot simulate, and we may never be able to. So for most users, our solution is force feedback. And force feedback is one of the most hotly contested topics because of that being our main connection to the car and to the road. So what makes one sim's force feedback better than another? Is it even better should be actually what we are asking. In my opinion, force feedback is a topic that is very subjective because it isn't a true one-to-one simulation of how a car behaves in real life. There is some room that's open to interpretation. And I think that is why we see so much contention in this question. Some people like their force feedback one way, some people like the force feedback the other way. So let's dive into what makes force feedback tick and why it matters. If we look at a title such as Assetto Corsa, it is meant to appeal to the consumer market. It is meant to have this feel that is accessible to all forms of drivers. So in addition to the forces that are applied at the steering rack, we are also seeing these additional forces meant to simulate the car's weight, the weight being transferred from one side to the other. I'm not going to say that's a bad thing, but it is definitely being added to the real forces that you would feel at the wheel. From my experience, I tended to find that Assetto Corsa's force feedback tends to have more feeling in some areas, tends to be more violent when you're sliding around and things like that. Some people like it, some people don't. Your mileage may vary. Then looking at R-Factor 2, the force feedback is quite a bit different. By default, it's going to simulate the forces at the steering rack and not much else. That means the force feedback in R-Factor 2 is going to largely feel a lot deader than other titles because not as much is going on through the steering rack as there is in Assetto Corsa, where the force feedback is going to be simulating more elements. Now, neither of these is right or wrong, it just tends to be a personal preference. Now, in Assetto Corsa, you can turn off those additional effects, and in R-Factor 2, you can actually turn on those effects. It comes down to what you want. However, you're going to spend more time customizing your force feedback if you're wanting to have a more in-depth experience. If you want to test out these different experiences for yourself, there actually is a solid option for you to tweak your force feedback to your heart's content. If you take a look at the free-to-play racing title Race Room Racing Experience, it has some incredibly in-depth force feedback adjustment options. So you can adjust the force feedback at the steering rack just as well as being able to add or subtract the additional force feedback effects to augment your driving. I'd say that's a great compromise for being able to have the most authentic steering, which could actually be seen as kind of boring, or the most immersive driving possible. One thing worth mentioning is when I have tested out professional sim racing rigs, such as the CXC Motion Pro 2 cockpit, the force feedback was very dialed down and was tweaked to simulate the steering at the rack. There weren't many additional steering effects. That is because the motion in the sim cockpit is giving you that immersive experience, so you don't really need the force feedback to compensate for that. However, if you don't have the money to shell out for a motion setup, the force feedback having more effects can be a great way to compensate for that lack of immersion in other parts of your body. As mentioned before, force feedback ultimately comes down to personal preference. There is no true, absolute right force feedback. If there was, all the titles would be using it. So these are just some quick thoughts on force feedback. What are yours? What title do you think has the best force feedback? Let us know in the comments. Also, if you like this video, please hit that like and subscribe button down below and help keep us on track. Also, check out the Sim Racing Paddock forums where you can join in on the community. For the Sim Racing Paddock, I'm William Marsh, and you have a great rest of your day.